That's all right. So I'll go ahead and go back to the title slide. This presentation is Reframing Language Class, Student Perceptions, Engagement, and Outcomes. And I'm Suki Jones Mozenter, coming from the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And for me, the work always starts with our students. And these were some of my students when I was an English language development or ELD teacher and ELD coach at a school whose student community spoke about 40 different primary languages at the time that I was working there. And while I was there, I also received my master's at St. Mary's College of California, a program that included a strong research component. And some of the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today is actually comes from the work that I did there at St. Mary's College. And what I was really interested in was the idea of targeted ELD. And that was something that I was responsible for as the English language development teacher. And one of the things that we understood is that targeted ELD instruction is beneficial for students who are acquiring English as an additional language. And this meant giving students instruction that was targeted to both their level of English proficiency and their grade level. And to do this, the practice in our school, as at many other schools, was to group students by both grade level and their assessed English proficiency level for the targeted instruction. And some schools handle targeted ELD by having classroom teachers work with small groups within their usual instructional day, which can be particularly challenging if you have 3 different groups based on students' proficiency levels, as well as students who are not classified as English language learners, so they don't receive targeted ELD. It's a lot for a classroom teacher to juggle. So many schools handle targeted ELD with what's called a pull-out model, where students are pulled out of their class by another teacher each day for a period of targeted ELD instruction. And at this school, we used a modified pull-out model for targeted ELD. This meant that we created homogeneous ability groups for all students at a particular grade level, both English language learners and then students classified as English only. We then divided those groups among the classroom teachers and support staff, like myself as the ELD teacher, for a period of targeted, differentiated language and literacy instruction. In this way, our students were able to get their targeted ELD instruction. But this meant that basically we were also tracking our students, or as it's more often referred to in elementary, putting our students into ability groups. And the research pretty clearly suggests that ability grouping is detrimental for all students, but particularly for the students who were grouped in the lower ability groups. Being in a lower ability group is associated with negative impacts on both student identity and sense of belonging, as well as long-term academic outcomes. And to my way of thinking, given that we were grouping all of the students at a grade level into homogeneous ability groups, the students who were grouped together because we perceived them to have the lowest English proficiency were in the lowest ability group. For the most part, these were the kids that I was responsible for teaching. And I was really wondering how to give them the benefits of targeted ELD instruction without the costs of ability grouping. So I came across some really interesting small psychological interventions that were being done. They were being done largely in higher education contexts. And they seemed to have some real promise in terms of addressing historically marginalized students' negative identities and sense of lack of belonging. And again, they were small, rather quick interventions that seemed to have really large impacts. And I started wondering if this was something that I could do with my own students that would offset the negative impacts of ability grouping for ELD instruction. And so some of this work is that I was basing it on was done out of Stanford by Walton and Cohen, looking at um, different sorts of interventions that they did with large groups of students entering higher ed. And then they moved into secondary, but they had not done this work in the primary level, which is the level that I was working at. So I was really interested in one aspect of these psychological interventions where they did something where they could kind of reframe the context, the instructional context. And I thought this could be something that I could do to reframe ELD as a rigorous language instruction course in order to prove student outcomes. I thought this might mitigate negative impacts on students' identity and their sense of belonging. And so I used the research of Jeffrey Cohn, David Yeager, Gregory Walton, and also the work of Claude Steele, and designed an intervention where for my ELD groups, I set up an application process for what I called a rigorous course of language instruction. The students completed in the class the application forms and essays, and these were actually the focus of our language instruction for that week. Now, I did this for students in grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it was appropriate to their grade level. It was also appropriate to their English language proficiency level. So for instance, the application forms and essays were required more free writing from the 5th graders than it did from the 2nd graders. The 2nd graders, some of their focus was much more on kind of smaller pieces like writing an address, knowing the difference between first name, last name, middle name, items like that. And we completed those applications during the course of instruction for a week. At the end of the week, I issued acceptance letters. And of course, every student was accepted. They all received a letter of acceptance. And I renamed the course and called it, rigorous language instruction course. But it was the exact same classroom. It was the exact same students. It was the exact same teacher, myself. And I made no change in my instructional practice. So on Friday, they received their letters of acceptance. And then on Monday, they showed up to the exact same room to something that I had called a new course. When the students received the acceptance letters, it was towards the end of the day, they actually ran around the yard of the school showing everyone that they had gotten in. And they ran out to their parents at the end of the day, and the parents commented how excited the students were. And it was just a real buzz. And again, every student was accepted. Then we began 6 weeks of what we called rigorous language instruction. And I observed increased engagement in the class. The students seemed more eager to come to the class than they had been previously. So just as a reminder, this was a time when they would leave their regular classroom. All of the students at that grade level would go to different teachers, and these particular students would come with me. And some of them had been kind of reluctant to come. They didn't want to leave their friends. They didn't want to leave their classroom. But I noticed that there was more eagerness to actually come to ELD. But I really wanted to see if there was, some sort of impact specifically on their identities. So I used a pre and post measure of positive and negative aspects of academic identity. There was no change in the students' positive academic identity, which had been high from the beginning. However, there was a reduction in students' negative academic identity. The other thing that I observed at the end, because of course, as part of ELD, I gave them regular English proficiency assessments, and their gains were unusually high over the course of that 6-week period. And again, this was something where there was no change in the course other than this application process. and this renaming of it, no change in the instructional practices. Observed this increased engagement and excitement from the students. Saw no change in what was already a relatively high positive academic identity, but did see a reduction in negative academic identity, and saw significant growth in terms of their English language proficiency, to the point where in the 5th grade group in particular, I had 2 levels of growth was the mean, which is not, is much more typical for over a course of a year rather than 6 weeks. So what this really started me to think about is, what we as teachers show our students is one thing, right? Here's this course, it's ELD. I use the same instructional practices. I call it this rigorous course of language instruction. It's still the same thing. But how our students make sense of what they see, that's something different. And thinking about this has actually led me to do further research in looking at students' identities and how they make sense of various instructional practices and structures that we use within particularly primary school settings. But given the context for today's presentation, one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I hope that we can open this up for some discussion as well, is thinking about some of these elements that are different from this context than from the context that I imagine that you all are working in. So for instance, this was a required ELD course. This was not an elective outside of regular schooling. This happened during their regular instructional day, but it was only for a subset of students. Although all students were separated and put into small groups, ELD was for this particular subset of students, which might be different from your context. Also, English, which was the target of the instruction, was also the medium of instruction throughout the instructional day. So this is a school where English was the medium of instruction. There was no other language that was used as the medium of instruction throughout the instructional day. Although we did have over 40 different primary languages that were spoken by students. Also, ELD being taught in an English dominant context. Some of the work that I had done in ELD prior to this, still here in the United States, had been in communities that were not English dominant communities. So communities where, for instance, Spanish was the dominant language or Mandarin was the dominant language within the community, within a larger English dominant context. In this particular community, however, English was very much the dominant language in the context. And so thinking about how ELD within an English dominant context might impact the outcomes of an intervention like this. And so what I'm really interested in hopefully discussing with you all is what could be implications for TESOL in contexts where English is not the dominant language, in thinking about potentially reframing language courses, TESOL courses, in order to shift the way that the students see them in a way that might positively impact their identity, their engagement, and then, of course, the language outcomes, which is our ultimate goal, I think. So with that, I'd love to hear what folks think.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Does anybody have any questions, and what do they think about this kind of reframing in their own context? I know that we're all hopefully watching from different places around the world.
Can I just jump in with a quick question?
Please do.
I'm kind of out of touch with the idea of intervention. So can you talked about this as an intervention. Can you kind of define what that means?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this, when I'm talking about an intervention in this particular case, it's within within the scope of a research study. And so this was actually a test to see whether or not by changing something, that would be the intervention, making a change within the context would result in the desired outcome. And so in this case, the change was the things like the acceptance letter and the application and the change of the name of the course. And those were identified as the interventions. So I had this learning context that was already established. I was going to make one change, and that would be the intervention, and wanted to see whether or not that would have an impact on the outcome.
Right, so the increasing the prestige of this course is going to affect the dependent variable of student participation.
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I have something to add. Actually, I think this would be really interesting to try in the Korean context for, in schools, there's often remedial classes for learners who are a bit behind their classmates. It could be for various reasons. They don't get opportunities to do extra English like their peers in after school, or they might have other learning difficulties, or they might just not really like English that much and not really want to put time and effort into it. So I think this would be really interesting to try in the context of Korean public schools for kids who we're trying to help, you know, them keep pace with their peers. And that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has not been tested around this is what's the durability of the intervention, right? So once it becomes, you know, if you call it a rigorous course of instruction, for instance, well, you know, this intervention lasted for 6 weeks. But if it's now just the rigorous course of language instruction, but it's the same kids who continue to go throughout the years, then they start to realize, oh no, this is actually just the same thing that it's always been. So one of the questions that I have is how to actually extend the intervention in a positive way, in a way where the students are, you know, they get wise to it right after a certain amount of time. And I was actually quite surprised that the students didn't get a sense of kind of the thinness of the intervention, right? The veil was quite thin on this. And so I'd be interested in looking at how you could sustain this over time, if that's even a possibility.
That's a good point. We even during the summer and winter camps, we will have different levels. So camps, just the normal kind of camp, and then the camp for people who need extra help. So I think in that case, it might be really, really useful for us to try that. That's a much shorter time frame, 2 weeks usually, but yeah, over a semester, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. You never know, they might really buy into it. And but yeah, that's something that maybe going forward, maybe I can suggest with my co-teachers and anything. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? We still have 5 minutes. So if there are no other questions, I'm just going to stop the recording.